Hello, and welcome to the Paradise of Fools. I'm Ed Hollett with another edition of the Bondcast, the podcast of the Sir Robert Bond Papers. You can find us at edhollett.substack.com, and today's topic is the collapse of Newfoundland and Labrador healthcare. What we're talking about here is the publicly operated, publicly funded healthcare system. There's a lot more to healthcare than that, and that's a subject potentially for another day. But what we're going to talk about today is the healthcare system, which is the healthcare authorities, the hospitals, and everybody who works in them. The image here is The Bureaucrat by an artist named Ian Norbury. It's a wood carving, and the bureaucrat is a good symbol for this because the major problem in healthcare is bureaucracy, as is a common theme for me. And I want to try to go through this today fairly quickly because a lot of what I've talked about here, we've talked about before. It was prompted by two things. This piece is prompted by two things. One, the appointment of Pat Parfrey as CEO of the Newfoundland and Labrador Health Authority. Parfrey is a 74-year-old retired nephrologist, kidney specialist, who a couple of years ago was appointed by the Premier to run a thing called the Health Accord, which supposedly is the plan for restructuring and revising the health system in Newfoundland and Labrador. It really isn't, but that's a whole other issue we can talk about. But I want to talk specifically about his appointment, and I want to highlight something else you may not have seen, which is a report by the C.D. Howe Institute on the state of healthcare in Canada. See if we can get through this as quickly as we can. I don't want to belabor it for you on a Monday morning, which will be a blessing, as some of you will know. C.D. Howe commissioned a study that looked at the healthcare system in 10 countries that are comparable to Canada, in Europe and the United States. So 10 countries. In a set of categories, access to care, administrative efficiency, equity, and so on, Canada finished 9 out of 10 across the board and finished last of all in timeliness. The study also looked at the health systems of each of the provinces and territories in Canada. And Newfoundland and Labrador finished 12th out of 13 overall. That shouldn't surprise anyone. We spend the most money per capita of any place in Canada except maybe Alberta, and we chronically and consistently have the poorest performance across the board in just about every category. The problems we're facing today are the result of decades of the same sorts of approaches, thinking, policies. There have been some individually better or worse decisions made, and sometimes horrendously bad decisions. But the whole structure, the way the healthcare system works, particularly the government funded system and government policies, all drive this. So we're getting that consistent result across the board. Last place for access, second last place for care process, 10th out of 10 for equity, or 10th out of 13 for equity, and 11th for outcomes. Uh, just so that we get us in comparison, know where it's coming from. Um, the study by C.D. Howe covers the period 2021 to 2023. It's based on data from the Center, uh, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, CIHI, which gets its data from the provincial health authorities, plus information from the World Health Authority and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Um, the Health Accord, which we're going to talk a little bit about, came along in 2022, and it also has provincial health data because they're both working off the same data set. You can go back and look at these definitions just so you understand the scope and complexity of this C.D. Howe Institute report and why it's so important. Why it's so important. I think it's something that we should be talking about very seriously to understand that despite the fact that we've had a health accord, and despite the changes that have already been happening in healthcare, there is not a significant change in the first 2 to 3 years out of a 10-year period that this health accord is supposed to change everything here. Things haven't changed at all. There's no demonstrable difference. Where are we? Well, actually, in equity, we're not too bad. Um, we're ahead of New Brunswick, Manitoba, and the Yukon. Not hard to do, though, if you're in a population that is not significantly diverse. Equity, in this case, the definition is primarily to do with racial barriers. They didn't find too many, apparently. Not my study. Don't come at me about problems in Labrador for Inuit, um, for non for urban indigenous people. Don't complain to me. It's not my study. I'm just saying that they found that. But if you stop and look at Newfoundland and Labrador, it is 95, 96% locally born of European ancestry, English speaking. It's a pretty homogeneous group, so its equity problem is not surprising that we're in relatively good shape. We're still 10th. If you look at virtual care, we're actually amazingly, only behind British Columbia. And if you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would say that we are down at the bottom of the pile somewhere down here with Germany, maybe, because there was very little of any support for any but the most traditional ways of and old-fashioned paper-driven and bureaucratic ways of dealing with healthcare. Um, Privately funded, privately operated healthcare tends to be more efficient, tends to be better at delivering care in a timely way. It's much more responsive to patient needs. Um, but this was a good example up until relatively recently. But COVID forced a major change, and that major change produced results. But if you go overall, you're going to see that in affordability, but particularly in timeliness and access to care, which is the most significant one, we are at the bottom of the pile, with only the United States lower than us for affordability and access. Not really a great place to be. The sort of things we've heard from in the health accord updates that we received over the last 2 or 3 years are very vague, and they're about things like family care teams, which are not up and running for the most part. Most are not working at all or are nowhere near full capacity. Yes, we've created one big health authority, but so what? There's nothing that's in the health accord that could not have been delivered under the old system, and the creation of a single large bureaucracy um, did not make any difference to improving access to care. Most of the things that you've seen the government announce in terms of even things like the accessibility plan or the human resource plan are things that could have been delivered and in the past have been delivered without a massive new highly centralized bureaucracy. The Waterford replacement too is not connected to this at all. So what was the healthcare accord really all about? Well, in the most recent update, which was last September, 56 calls to action, 31 of which they were still at the policy development stage, which means there's no meaningful action taken to get them in place. Two, no action at all because they were described as needing further work. And 24 had started, but there was no real indication of where they were. Not surprisingly, if you go looking for a copy of a report that says update, that shows you a set of indicators and where we are with those indicators, you can't find it. Certainly, if it exists, I couldn't find it. And I did a fairly sort of basic search of government's website and the health authority's website and and news releases which introduced um, that said there would be an update or somebody had delivered an update. If they're out there, it's interesting to see. It's difficult to find, and there's certainly no video of it available on the government's website. So there don't appear to be any standard metrics. The news reports didn't include anything on this either. They tended to include some of the things that we'd already heard, but none of the sense of here are our goals, here's the timeline to introduce those goals, and where are we with them. Instead, we get these sort of statements like the one we got from Tom Osborne in the first update, where he said, we're actually seeing excitement now at the administrative level, and it's starting to percolate down through some of our health professions as well. Well, things don't percolate down. Percolation usually goes up, but that's another issue. And if the bureaucrats are excited, so what? Are healthcare professionals excited? Yeah. The reason the bureaucrats are excited is because the task was simple. They were, all the people who made the mess were told to clean up the mess they made within the same set of assumptions they'd always used. And not surprisingly, their answer was more of the same, which is exactly what happened with rate mitigation. Government asked the same people who designed the system to tell us how to do it differently. And they said, just do it the same. And that's what happened here with this. So we see many more bureaucrats. All the health authority regions are still in place. They still have CEOs. In the Eastern Zone, they went from 1 to 2. So there actually are more at the operational level. And there's now another bureaucracy on top of it, all of it at much higher cost, with no measurable strategic improvements in any form of care. Lots of tactical things have happened to deal with orthopedics or cardiac and so on. All of those things could have happened without all of the extra bureaucrats and cost. Simple truth. It is basically, I'll get to the joke in a minute. Instead, what you've seen are things like the travel nurse problem, but particularly the corruption in the travel nurse program and the very obvious cover up of the problem, the scope and extent of it by government and by officials of the health authority. And that's a norm these days in government, limited accountability and transparency, epitomized by the treatment that the House of Assembly receives, which is the ultimate expression of accountability and transparency. And instead, it's reduced to a rubber stamp. I think China would be embarrassed that if we suggested that they should treat their legislature the same way ours runs. North Korea would probably have a busier legislature than the one in Newfoundland and Labrador, and one with probably a little bit more power. Only a minor exaggeration. But one of the things about the healthcare accord that it reflects more than anything else is the distorted focus and reality of healthcare. It's not a whole package. It does not look at the whole delivery of healthcare, which includes historically things that are publicly funded and publicly delivered, things that are publicly funded and privately delivered, and some things which are privately delivered and privately funded. We've had a blended, very efficient healthcare system. And as we've tried to squeeze the private sector out of healthcare in its delivery, your family doctor operates in the private sector. They are not a government corporation. They are a private sector corporation. They just happen to be paid, for the most part, by public money. We need to recognize that and value that and understand the role that the private sector can play in the delivery of healthcare, because it always has. And it's historically been much more efficient and effective at doing it. The problem we have, this is distorted focus of government, as one friend of mine told me over the weekend. I was sitting in a meeting and hearing a big discussion from the health authority about changes to healthcare, and there was no reference at all to family doctors. At least not family doctors who weren't already working for the healthcare authority. And that reflects, as I pointed out to my friend, my experience 15 years ago when the government was doing something and got the health authority to run the communications program for it. And the communications ignored entirely anybody who didn't work for the health authorities. And so everything had to be expanded, changed, altered, and others had to step in to fill in the gaps for a significant chunk of people who are dealing with, who on a daily basis were doing a lot of healthcare. These days, the attitude, though, is if it's not ours, absorb it. And this is particularly the case of family docs. The goal of government's health authority plan, and this is one of Pat Parfrey's pet ideas, because after all, he doesn't really think family doctors know what they're doing, is to get rid of them. The plan with family care teams is to eliminate your family doctor and instead have you report to a warehouse where you will be seen by somebody, a health professional of some kind. And it becomes a bureaucratic way of saying everybody has a doctor. In the Department of National Defense about 40 years ago, the Army needed rain gear. So they created a program and everybody got rain gear. The problem was didn't keep out the rain. The project manager said, "No, I was only asked to give everybody rain gear, and they got it. Whether it works or not wasn't one of the metrics I needed." That's how bureaucracy works. That's how bureaucracy thinks. That's what's running healthcare in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's less about the care and it's more about the other stuff. The end result, of course, is that as far as healthcare delivery and the evolution of healthcare bureaucracy in Newfoundland goes, it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark without Indiana Jones. The answer still would come out the same way. And in this case, Indy is the people paying for this through their taxes. And that big boulder just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and is still bearing down on us. That's really what this is all about. Pat Parfrey's appointment as the CEO of the Health Authority, two pictures very similar, taken about a year apart. I leave your I leave it to you to make your own judgment about it though, but reflects, I think, a significant structural weakness in government. And I'm going to get into a bit of detail about that in a second. But it's a significant structural weakness in government. If after a competition they couldn't find anybody else who was vaguely qualified enough that they took the person who is the premier's buddy to get into a job that of the likes of which he has never done before. It's kind of strange. I'd like to see the metrics that were used to determine that he was the best person qualified for it. But I'll explain in a second why it's not just about the fact that he has no real experience in doing something like this. It's about what he was doing before and what appropriate roles are for different people in the system. I think this reflects as much as anything else the fact that he's a buddy of the premier's. It's cronyism, which is a common problem in system in Newfoundland and Labrador and in political cultures and political systems like ours. There is a tendency about restricting access to who gets into the pool. So there's a very, very limited set of criteria, and people from outside are excluded deliberately. So we continue to have a limited set of ideas. There's no refreshment and renewal. It's all a very closed system, and it's very incestuous and closes in on itself. But the most significant problem for this, for me, is what it tells us about the way government itself doesn't work. It reflects a lack of understanding of the difference of strategic direction and governance versus, hang on, I got to go back. Made a mistake, made a mistake. Stole some of my own thunder. Uh, Strategic versus operational. Cabinet's responsibility is to set broad policy and broad strategic goals, and then to allocate resources to achieve those targets within the various departments and operations that it funds. And once it's done that in the annual budget, the responsibility becomes to make sure that it's happening. And in order to do that, we have line departments in which there's a team of cabinet ministers for each department with a deputy minister as well. It's a permanent public servant who, with other public servants, are responsible for delivering the targets. That's the operational side of things. And those two things shouldn't cross over. The strategic is the strategic, the higher end governance, and the operational is the operational. And if you have people from the top one mucking around in the bottom one, it's going to become a less efficient system. And it's not going to work particularly well. There becomes a problem with accountability because, after all, a system like this works well when everybody knows what their part is in the system and who else is doing this same sort of thing. And they know, therefore, what they're responsible to do, and they can report up and they can also supervise down, depending on where they are in the system, in order to make things happen. And while sometimes people make jokes about, it's not my department, the reality is that that's actually one of the efficient ways of doing things is to specialize tasks. and that people have places in the hierarchy in order to accomplish certain functions. A very efficient way of running an organization is to set broad strategic direction at the top and leave room at the bottom end. The farther down you go, leave more and more and more room to accommodate things that you can't see from way up high in terms of adjusting and course and so on. And if there's a problem, the role of the people at the top end would be to step in a way to remove an obstacle or alter a course or to do something like that in response to a need that will keep everybody moving on the same path. But that's in a rarity. At the strategic level, you have one set of functions. At the operation, you have another. And if everybody knows what everybody else is doing, you can accomplish an awful lot of things. The fact that the government in Newfoundland and Labrador, does not really accomplish an awful lot of stuff and hasn't consistently for about 20 years, tells you that there's a chronic organizational problem inside government. Go back to Danny Williams used to talk about the serial government. They could only do one thing at a time. That's the same thing that we're still talking about. But what I want you to notice in particular is on the left-hand side here, where you see there's the cabinet with the ministers and the premier at the top, then the minister and the deputy minister, in this case of health, and where Pat would report wind up is down in the bottom here, where the CEO is. There'd be a pile of people down below him, but this is towards the upper level. But notice that Pat's basically two, maybe three steps down in the food chain here. There's actually another person in between. There'd probably be an assistant deputy minister in between the CEO and the deputy minister. But this is a simplified program. That's what this should look like. But what has happened with this is that last point, which is that the chassis of government, of the machine that is government, is now fundamentally twisted. It's consistent with the pattern of increasingly autocratic government and decreasingly democratic government in Newfoundland and Labrador, typified by the decreased role of the House of Assembly, but it is across the board. That the cooperative, collaborative government, the structure and organization of government, is replaced by one in which things are done by people with a strong personal relationship to the person with the most power. And in this particular case, what's happened is that, in effect, this decision takes Pat Parfrey, the Premier's friend, and makes him the de facto minister slash deputy minister of health, since most of what government spends in healthcare is through the health authority. And the Premier is looking to Pat effectively to replace the department for all intents and purposes, and significantly alters the role that John Hogan and the Deputy Minister of Health and the ADMs have. And I've drawn this picture this way to reflect those changed positions. It puts John Hogan in a very significantly difficult spot. Normally, a minister would give direction to the CEO, but in this case, if they don't get along or they don't agree, Pat doesn't want to do it. Pat's one phone call away from putting John in his place. And that's a perpetual problem. No system can function with that kind of personal relationships that will interfere with the adequate administration or the proper administration and just the orderly and effective administration of it. It bends and breaks the system of accountability in a way that is problematic. But it's very familiar. It's very familiar. We've seen this before. In healthcare specifically, we saw during the Cameron inquiry that Danny Williams created direct lines of control into the bureaucracy in health and at the Eastern Health Authority in St. John's to control the response outside of the lines of normal accountability. And in the most spectacular example of this, John Abbott, now a cabinet minister, was the deputy minister of health at the time, prepared a briefing note for the premier and sent it directly to the premier, and never told Tom Osborne, who was the minister at the time, about it. And this was an example of John knowing what side his bread was buttered on and where the minister fit into the scheme of things. But this was a one-off. This is not the way normally things worked. Now it's the permanent way it works. And you have a minister of health and a deputy minister of health who are significantly diminished as a consequence, not of anything other than the close personal relationship between the premier and the head of the health authority. So the ability to get new ideas, the ability to take corrective action is significantly reduced. The chances for groupthink are much, much higher because you're talking about a much, much smaller decision-making circle, which is basically now the premier and Pat. And, as I would understand it, Pat's been somewhat frustrated in his job because the big machine doesn't always jump when you tell it to jump. And sometimes it shouldn't jump. Sometimes there are legitimate reasons why some of the ideas that have been coming from Pat's team don't work out the way they planned. And there are lots of difficulties that they never thought about. But just because they're running into difficulties doesn't mean that the problem is the people in between them um, and getting something done. It may mean, as I would suggest you more likely is the case, that their ideas in the first place were out of whack with reality. In a proper system, you'd have taken that into account in the planning end of things. This is where we're going this week because the health authority now is in the same position as Nalcor, pretending it's Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro. And in some respects, it's the same as the university, although the university is a little bit different. But they effectively, the three of them together, share certain common characteristics, which we'll talk about in more detail over the next 2 or 3 days, Wednesday and again on Friday. I've likened them to Cerberus, the legendary three-headed dog of Greek mythology that guarded the gates to the underworld. Now, Cerberus also had snakes and serpents coming out of its body and a tail like a dragon, but that's just a little bit too much imagery for me. Let's just focus on the three heads of the hellhound. And they share these characteristics for sure. They're unaccountable, they're corrupt in various meanings of that word. Um, and they're certainly cronyistic in terms of their leadership. Um, both the relationship between some leaders like Pat and the premier, but also internally in terms of how people get hired, who does what to whom inside the system. And they're very closed systems before. They also share the quality of being costly, extremely costly, inefficient, and ineffective at what they're doing. They become, as I used the description in some cases, they're more like self-licking ice cream cones, which is the ultimate bureaucratic thing in which they just exist for the sake of existing. They've lost purpose in many respects, but they are constantly growing as organizations. Empires, people are building lovely empires for themselves. And one of the questions you have to ask yourself in the case of this relationship between Pat Parfrey and the Premier in their new control of the health system is what happens when Andrew Furey leaves or there's a change in government. One of the challenges a new government is going to be faced with, even if it is a new liberal government with a different premier, is to fix this kind of relationship. Right? Look at it this way. It reflects the same kind of relationship that there was between, for example, Danny Williams and Ed Martin at Nalcor. So when Danny left and left Ed behind, was Kathy Dunderdale really running as much as people think she was running? Or did Danny Williams still have a huge amount of direct and indirect influence over what was happening? Opinions vary, but I would suggest to you that the power structures and the power relationships aren't necessarily reflected often in who's actually in office. We're not talking about um, a textbook example here. It's a very interesting political culture here. But I'll put it to you that way. But what we have here is constantly growing bureaucratic empires that are the three-headed dog. I'd be remiss if at this point I didn't talk about UncleNarly.ca, which is back, producing some great stuff about the 69 deal. The most recent one is the MOU and Fiore Fiscal Management, which left out the word miss in there, or the prefix miss in management. Um, that particular column does a really good example, does a really good analysis of the strategic issues that were in behind, particularly the financial problems government has, and therefore why it is that the government was pressured into um, taking a very bad deal that is horrendous is horrendously poor in terms of the amount of money that we're giving away electricity for, but also for the enormous amount of control that Quebec has over the future of hydroelectric development in Labrador. Because it's not a Newfoundland and Labrador project anymore. Labrador has almost been, Labrador certainly energy in terms of electricity on the river, the Churchill River has become mortgaged um, to Hydro-Quebec. That piece that you can find at Uncle Gnarly does a really good job of talking about what's happening, but why is it happening? Well, I think it reflects where we've been for the last 20 years because we've had a series of administrations, starting with Danny through Kathy, then Dwight, and now Andrew, who came into office with very little idea about what they wanted to do, or in some cases, no plans, goals, or objectives at all. And in some cases, and in all cases, no actual organizing for governing. There was no organization that was set up to actually govern, which the political people need to bring with them and as they move into the offices in government alongside the public service. Um, we are very much in a permanent campaign, although it's really now evolved into a perpetual campaign because it is less purposeful. Won't get into the difference between a permanent campaign and this other thing, but the phrase I'll draw you back to is the one from Friday's column, which was long and detailed and rich and full of stuff. But the key idea was we've been stuck in the perpetual hell of pre-election mode ever since Andrew Furey took office in 2020. And there is no sign it will end soon. And in some respects, the same can be said of the period before that, and certainly was true of the period back to 2023. I've come to calling it the Squid Game, and it's as good a game as I can name as I can think for it. And for me, the House of Assembly is the epitome of this because the House is supposed to be the the body to which we all elect people to oversee government, to keep the government accountable to the rest of us. And in the context of the Churchill Falls deal, it is the ultimate independent oversight, independent of government. Except in Newfoundland and Labrador, the House of Assembly is completely controlled by government. It's been absorbed into government, and it is as as dependent as it could possibly be. It's actually not dependent; it's subordinate, which means that the system is fundamentally broken. It goes back as another example of why government in Newfoundland and Labrador is broken, fundamentally broken in a terrible way. But I just wanted to point out this example that I came across, which was in a review that I wrote of James McLeod's book, Turmoil as Usual, about politics in Newfoundland about 10 to 15 years ago. McLeod rightly concludes, I said, that the House of Assembly is irrelevant to the province and the way it's run. It's a matter of power, and the new premier, then Dwight Ball, is no more likely to relinquish that power than any of his recent predecessors who have systematically reduced the House of Assembly to its current level of irrelevance. The House is even more diminished now than it was a decade ago. And it will take some incredible effort to transform this society back or into something else that is not as fundamentally autocratic as it is right now. Spectacularly so. Anybody who wants to look at Donald Trump should just look around locally. to see that it's not necessarily all that dramatic. It's not necessarily all that difficult. It just happens because it happens. People turn a blind eye. It's easier to happen in a small place like Newfoundland and Labrador than it is in the United States. In many ways, I started to call Danny Williams proto-Trump because there were a great many similarities between Williams and Trump 1. And that approach, that way of thinking about government and how government operates, the relationship between the people and government, carries on to today. It's fundamentally autocratic. It's very old-fashioned. It's very much a 19th century social hierarchy, class divisions, and a particular kind of tyranny of autocrats, technocrats, and specialists. But the House is diminished and reduced to the point where we could get rid of elections tomorrow and simply not have this election if it was constitutionally possible. And it wouldn't fundamentally alter anything. That's something you really should think about because it's much more significant to that long-term trajectory of where we're going. And it demonstrates the extent to which the problems we're currently having, the changes that are being made to the fundamental relationships inside government, will have profound and I think negative impacts on us in the years ahead. That's it. We're done. I'll just remind you that if you haven't already become a subscriber, at least get on the free email list. And if you're already on the free email list, consider taking the next step and spending that $50 to become a paying supporter of Bond Papers. And if you've done nothing else, click the share button, which you'll find in the post in the column at Bond Papers, and send this on to somebody else. If you're getting it by email, feel free to share it. I know a lot of you already do. Some of you send them to me by mistake, but it's all good for a good fun, and I get a chuckle out of it. And it starts off sometimes some interesting conversations. But please feel free to share, subscribe, and pass this around. And we'll see you again for the next episode of the Bond Papers.